Welcome back, friends. Hopefully, you had a great holiday season, or at the least, survived it. So, during the last 2 weeks that the podcast was on break, I found myself reflecting a lot on Exodus chapter 14. And when I first came to faith, there was a book in the Bible that I just connected to. As I read it, it was almost like so much stuff in my life made sense and it brought so much comfort to me. But if you've ever read the Old Testament books, you know they're pretty dark. It's a little like episodes of Stranger Things, where you think you finally understand the monsters that are trying to destroy you, but then a new one pops up and you are screwed all over again. Well, until God swoops in and punches the Demogorgon in the face. All right, maybe it's not exactly like Stranger Things, but whatever. It's topical. Exodus 14 is the story of Moses rescuing the Israelites from Egypt. It's a story where God parts the Red Sea and then the Israelites wander for years and years in the desert. And then they basically conclude they were better off as slaves in Egypt than living in the desert surviving on manna, which is really just a flaky substance that appeared on the ground. I picture it to look like floor dandruff. Sounds appetizing. But I think why it speaks to me so loudly is because there are moments in life when you feel completely boxed in. Not just metaphorically boxed in. Sometimes it's actually boxed in. The kind of boxed in where there's no obvious good option, no clean exit, no version of the story where you come out looking calm or spiritual or emotionally regulated. You are stuck between what feels impossible and what feels unsafe. And if you're honest, your prayer in those moments, it's not deep, it's not poetic. It's usually something like, God, please remove this pressure, remove this conflict, remove this person, remove the fear, remove the thing that is chasing me that I cannot outrun. But what if sometimes God doesn't remove the enemy? What if he sometimes uses the enemy? And what if the miracle that we are asking for is not actually the miracle that we need? And that is where Exodus chapter 14 meets us. It's not in some triumphant worship moment, not in a tidy faith story where everything unfolded like a beautiful fairy tale, but in a moment of panic, accusation, fear, and desperation. And this is the part of the Exodus story that we love to summarize, but we rarely sit in. It's the Red Sea part, the walls of water part, the miracle part. But before the miracle, there is a setup that feels wildly uncomfortable. And if we rush past that, then we miss what God is actually revealing about how he works. One of the most unsettling details in the story is that God intentionally leads Israel into what looks like an absolute trap. Scripture tells us that God deliberately avoids the shorter, safer route out of Egypt. He doesn't take them the way that would make the most sense strategically. Instead, he takes them toward the sea. In other words, this was not an accident. This was not poor navigation, and this wasn't Moses missing a turn on the route. God leads them to a place where they will have no escape route except for him. They had to choose to trust in faith, get slaughtered, or drown in the Red Sea. Those were their options. And that is deeply unsettling because we would much prefer a God who rescues us from impossible situations and not a God who leads us into the impossible situations. But there's really something important happening here. God is not just trying to deliver Israel from Egypt. He is reshaping how they understand dependence and freedom and trust. They are newly freed, but they still think like slaves. They still assume that survival depends on their circumstances staying manageable, and they still believe that safety equals God's presence. And God knows something that they don't know yet. If they leave Egypt with an easy exit, Egypt will always remain an option. We all have an Egypt in our lives. When I first got married, I was 21 years old, and it was to a man who's not currently my husband today. Our whole relationship was friction and discontent. We were two puzzle pieces that fit together through force, but not by design. A few years into our marriage, I got pregnant, and then just a few months later, I miscarried. I didn't even know God at this time, but I was so mad at him for taking my child away. I struggled with my grief after that, and somewhere in the height of my grief, I had extreme clarity. My husband wasn't my puzzle piece, and I was tired of forcing our pieces together to only show an image of chaos and confusion. So I knew instinctively that he wasn't the end of my story. He was my Egypt. It would have been easy to stay with him, but I would have been a version of a slave. And so I made the choice to leave and carry the embarrassment of being a 24-year-old divorcee. And it felt like an impossible circumstance because I would have been leaving the marriage with nothing. I would have had to start my life completely over, but God called me out of my Egypt and into a desert that eventually would strengthen me and prepare me for my future husband, my current husband. But the thing is, we gloss over the fact that God will sometimes use a bad circumstance to lead us, and other times he'll use our enemies to lead us. For the Israelites, their enemy was Pharaoh. And as they are led out of Egypt, no surprise, Pharaoh shows up. Pharaoh was the thing that the Israelites feared the most, the power they thought they had escaped, the enemy they assumed God would keep at a distance. And then the people start to panic. They'll start accusing Moses. They start rewriting history and say things like, gosh, wasn't it better when we were slaves? Which sounds dramatic until you realize how human that reaction is. Because fear has a way of making bondage look familiar and freedom look absolutely reckless. Here is the disorienting truth of the passage. Pharaoh is enraged and his army chasing after the Israelites. It does not just threaten Israel. It actually forces movement and fast from them. If Pharaoh is not behind them, running after them in anger, then Israel's probably going to camp out by the sea. They'll wait. They'll hesitate. They'll stall. They'll wait for another option. And then the enemy becomes the pressure that pushes them forward into what God has already prepared. And this is where theology gets real, but very often dismissed. God is not endorsing Pharaoh, and he does not partner with evil. But God did harden the heart of Pharaoh, which fueled his rage and anger, and it created a speed and thirst in Pharaoh that risked God's chosen people, not to harm the Israelites, but to motivate them. So God will sovereignly use opposition to accomplish deliverance. And sometimes the thing that's chasing you is the very thing that's going to keep you from turning back. Let's be honest about what Israel wanted. They wanted safety. They wanted predictability. Maybe they wanted a miracle that didn't actually require courage. They didn't ask for some sea to part. They just simply asked for Pharaoh to go away. But God knew that removing Pharaoh without some sort of transformation would only delay the problem. The Red Sea crossing is not just some rescue mission. It is how God delivers severance. God does not just save them from danger. He wants to remove the possibility of ever going back. And that's hard because most of us want deliverance with a return policy because we like familiar. We want God to free us, but not permanently. We want relief, but not like complete transformation. And we want change, but we do still kind of like options. The miracle that the Israelites wanted was comfort, but the miracle that they needed was absolute freedom. And those are not always going to be the same thing. One of the most interesting dynamics in this chapter is who hears from God and who doesn't. Think about this. Moses is the one that's hearing direction from God, but the Israelites that are trying to be saved, they hear nothing. It's absolute silence. And so the people, of course, they start to panic because silence to them feels like abandonment. But Moses stands firm because silence doesn't always mean inactivity. God's not explaining the plan to the crown. He gives Moses one instruction. That's it. Move forward. And that is huge. That is theologically significant because faith in scripture is often less about emotional confidence and it's more about the obedient movement without full clarity. God doesn't say, okay, here's how this is going to work. He just says, go. And that is deeply uncomfortable for people who want guarantees before they act in obedience. When I lost my child, I had no idea if I was ever going to have a child of my own in my future. And when I left my ex-husband, I had no clue what I would be walking into. I just knew that it was time to move forward. All I heard was go. And no other direction came after that. I just said yes, acted in obedience, but completely scared. There is a quiet but powerful detail in Exodus 14 that doesn't get enough attention, in my opinion. Because before the sea ever parts, before the people move, before the miracle actually becomes visible, God positions himself between Israel and Pharaoh. And scripture tells us that the angel of the Lord moves from the front of the camp to the back, and the pillar of cloud shifts. Darkness falls on one side, light on the other. Israel can't see what God is doing, but Pharaoh can't touch them. And this matters because most of us assume protection should feel obvious. We assume if God is guarding us, then we should feel calm. We assume if God is present, the fear should disappear. But in this moment, the fear did not disappear. The threat did not vanish. The army is still there. God's protection does not remove the enemy, but it creates space. And then God stands in the gap. And that tells us something deeply important about how God works. Sometimes God will not eliminate the danger immediately. Sometimes he just limits its reach. And sometimes he does not change the situation yet. He changes what the situation is allowed to do to you, which is frustrating because most of us would prefer God to be a little bit more efficient. We want instant removal, and God often offers more sustained presence. This moment shows us that deliverance is often a process. It's not an event. God's going to protect Israel before he frees them fully. And he creates margin before the movement. He's going to buy time before the breakthrough. And that is incredibly important for people who feel like they are barely holding it together, because some seasons are not about bold steps. They are about surviving the night. Sometimes obedience looks like waiting while God holds the line. And then sometimes faith is not crossing the sea. It's just trusting that the enemy can't reach you while you stand still. There will be some seasons when God does not say go. And instead, he'll say, rest. I've got this part. And this is where the story meets real life in a way that feels deeply personal. Because there are going to be moments when you are not ready to move forward yet. You are exhausted, you are overwhelmed, and you are still trying to process what God has already done. And God, in his kindness, won't rush you. Instead, he'll position himself between you and whatever it is that it's threatening you. And that anxiety that feels loud but has not destroyed you yet. That fear that feels present but has not taken you out. And that pressure that feels relentless but somehow has not crushed you. That might be evidence that God is just there holding the line. Here is what this moment teaches us. God does not rush his people into miracles that they are not ready to carry. He's going to prepare them emotionally and spiritually for what comes next. Because the sea does not part while they are panicking. It parts after the night passes. And that tells us something profound. Some miracles require rest first. Some breakthroughs are going to require safety before bravery. And some transformations are going to require God to quiet the threat before he reveals the path. You are not behind if you are standing still, and you are not faithless if you are still afraid. You are not failing if you are waiting for morning. Sometimes waiting is not disobedience, it will be preparation. And so when God finally tells them to move, it's not reckless, it's not rushed, it's the next step right after protection, after presence, after the night had passed. And God did not just make a way through the sea, He made sure His people were still standing when it was time to walk. The miracle happens after disobedience begins. The sea wasn't parted before Moses knew they had to go through it. It happened after. When he raised his staff, the wind blew and then the path appeared. God didn't remove the sea, He made a way through it. And that matters because we often assume that God's presence means obstacle removal. But in this story, God's presence means a path creation. Because the water is still water, the fear is still very real, and the risk is still very present. But now there's a way forward. And sometimes the miracle is not the elimination of fear. Instead, it is the courage in the middle of the fear. Sometimes the miracle is not clarity, it's just trust in the movement. And here's one of the most beautiful truths in the story. Because the same sea that saved Israel ends up being the same sea that destroyed Pharaoh's army. It was the same water and the same path, but a very different outcome. And so what we need to know about this is what can deliver God's people can also dismantle what once held power over them. There are things in your life that will not lose their power until you walk through the fear instead of asking God to remove it. And some enemies will only die when you stop running. The Red Sea was not just an escape route, it was a boundary line. Once crossed, the story could not be reversed. So here's the question this story asks us. Where do you feel trapped right now? What is behind you that you hoped God would remove? What's in front of you that feels impossible? And what if God is not absent in the moment? What if He's just positioning you? The miracle that you're praying for might not look like an escape. Instead, it might look like courage. It might look like movement. It might look like a freedom that you didn't even know how to ask for in the first place. Sometimes God uses the enemy. Sometimes He'll use the pressure, and sometimes He's going to use the fear. But it's never to harm you. It's to deliver you. Before we wrap up, I want to give you something more than a thought to sit with this week. I want to give you something to practice instead. Because stories like Exodus 14 are powerful, but they become transformational when we step into them personally. So here's your challenge. And this is not a do better, try harder challenge. This is a pay attention challenge. Step 1, name your Red Sea. Sometime this week, preferably not in a rush, write this question down. What feels impossible in front of me right now? Not what feels annoying or feels inconvenient, what feels truly impossible. And be honest. Don't spiritualize it. Don't clean it up for God. Just name the sea. And then step 2, I want you to identify what's chasing you. And then write this question underneath it. What is pressuring me from behind? Is it a fear of failure? Is it conflict that you're avoiding? Is it a relationship you don't know how to navigate? A version of yourself God already freed you from, but still tries to pull you backward? Pay attention here, because sometimes what we call stress is actually a threat to our obedience. And then step 3, discern the invitation. Now ask this question slowly. What step forward might God be inviting me into? Not all at once, but next. Not the 10-year plan, not the fully parted sea, just the next faithful step. Sometimes the step is action. Sometimes it's rest. Sometimes it's honesty. And sometimes the step is surrender. Sometimes the step is simply trusting that God is holding the line while you just catch your breath. And then step 4, pray a different prayer. This week, try praying this prayer instead of asking God to remove the pressure. God, help me trust that you are not wasting this moment. Show me where you are present, show me where you are protecting, and give me the courage to move when it is time. Let this be a week where you stop asking, why is this happening? And start asking, what might be God forming here? If you're listening to this and you feel stuck or boxed in or unsure which direction to go, I want you to hear this clearly. Being at the edge of the sea does not mean God has failed you. It often means he's closer than you think. And sometimes God's going to lead us to places where forward is the only option, not because he wants to scare us, but because he wants to free us. And sometimes the miracle is not that the enemy disappears. It is that the enemy no longer gets the final word. And so if all you can do right now is stand still and breathe, trust that God can stand between you and whatever it is you are fearing. And if it's time to move, trust that the sea does not have the authority to stop you when God has already made a way. You are not forgotten, you are not behind, and this moment is not being wasted. Thank you for being here, for trusting me with your time, and for continuing to faith it, even when the miracle looks different than you imagined.